Okay, thanks so much, Dave. And this is actually picking up on a theme that's been broached a couple times already during the morning and in the last session. So that's a nice segue. I'll try to reduce some of the redundancies if I can. But yeah, thanks so much for the organizers and for everyone who's here. I had a chance to live in Europe for a few years, but it's actually my first time in Scotland. So it's given me a chance to track down some of my family heritage. And I was thinking that's kind of coincidental because my paper today is a little bit about family heritage, specifically the family heritage of Enactivism. And I'm going to try to cast it as a bit of a feud between two warring siblings, if you will. Those who think that the phenomenological heritage of Enactivism should be embraced, and in what sense, and those who want to distance themselves a little bit from it. And the two siblings are autopoietic Enactivism, and here I'm going to be dealing mostly with the work of Evan Thompson, but I'd be happy to talk about other autopoietic Enactivists. And to save myself the tongue twister, I'll refer to that as just AE from now on. And then kind of the upstart warring faction, the younger sibling, would be the radical Enactivists. I'll refer to that as REC from now. And there I'm dealing mostly with the work of Daniel Hutto and Eric Mayen. Okay. And yeah, the theme is this issue of sense-making, to what extent we need this kind of concept in Enactivism, how it relates to phenomenological notions of sense-making, and what its scope is throughout the organic world. Okay. I don't have a presentation for you. I've got a handout. It's a little bit old-fashioned, less entertaining, but you can keep it. Not sure what the street value is. Okay. So as varieties of Enactivism, REC and AE have much in common. Both seek to overturn the classical dualisms that have characterized much of philosophy of mind and cognitive science. Both emphasize the importance of active, embodied, environmentally situated engagements for our understanding of organisms and their mentality. And both emphasize developmental processes as necessary to the understanding of life and mind. However, advocates of REC insist that there are decisive differences between the radical line and the views of the more conservative siblings. REC is adamant that there is an ubiquitous kind of basic cognition, they call this the cognition of basic minds, that is free of representations, contents, meanings, or other supposedly cognitivist trappings. The only mind that can be said to engage in meaning-making, or sense-making, are socially scaffolded, symbol-using minds. And REC claims that vestiges of cognitivism are on display when AE authors talk about sense-making, when they talk about the creation and consumption of meaning, or when they talk about enacting and bringing forth worlds or environments. And of course, the classic example, which we've already discussed a couple times today, the famous or infamous example, depending on how you like this kind of treatment, is the bacterium in the sugar gradient. And autopoietic Enactivists will say that the bacterium is making sense, it's bringing forth its environment, it's creating meaning in responding to this as a world of valence as opposed to just an objectivist kind of world. Right? So REC adamantly rejects such parlance. REC's basic minds are capable of a kind of intentional directedness and response that, if suitably augmented, provides a foundation for what they call sense-making. But in and of itself, they don't think that this should be called sense-making. It's not worthy of the name. So continuing this line of critique that was first put out in Hutto and Mayen's 2013 book, it has recently been argued in the Journal of Phenomenology and Cognitive Sciences by De Jesus in a 2016 paper that these vestiges of cognitivism and representationalism stem from Enactivism's phenomenological heritage, pointing specifically to the work of Hans Jonas there. And the suggestion has been that if Enactivists want to really break with representationalism, that they need to break with their phenomenological heritage. Okay? And that's the claim that I want to assess and critique today. But I'd like to look at a different line of of AE's phenomenological heritage, specifically the one that stems through Merleau-Ponty and by extension Köhler and Gestalt psychology, and see how that gives us a different line on the sense-making idiom, and if that gives us a different kind of defense of it. Specifically, I want to look at Merleau-Ponty's discussion of learning and animal problem solving that he advances in the structure of behavior, drawing on Köhler's work. And what this will give us is a partial defense and explanation of a slightly different sense of sense-making, one that I think is closer to the phenomenological sense of that term. And it will also give us a test case to advance towards REC, to see if they can deal with these kind of cases in a way that will be sensitive to the kinds of concerns Merleau-Ponty and Köhler have, and to their kinds of reasons for introducing an idiom of meaning-making or sense-making. Okay. So first, Merleau-Ponty on sense-making, looking at the structure of behavior a little bit here. The first thing I want to say is that the battery of concepts that Merleau-Ponty introduces there in the structure of behavior and continuing through phenomenology of perception is probably best looked at holistically as a sort of paradigm shift that he tries to induce in the sciences of life and mind, partially through an immanent critique of the views of his predecessors and contemporaries. I'm just going to draw out one line from that and try to treat it as self-standing and independent, but it should just be kept in mind that the full sense and defense, as you were, only comes from the paradigm as a whole. But we're just going to look at one line, and this is the aspect of animal problem solving and creative learning that he discusses in the structure of behavior. Okay, so we can get an appreciation for Merleau-Ponty's views on this topic by juxtaposing his position against the behaviorist account that he's rejecting. So a classical conditioning approach to learning or adaptive behavior sees the acquisition of a new behavior as fundamentally a matter of trial and error. Once a desirable solution to a problem is struck upon through a fortuitous movement or gesture, its association with the desired outcome through repetition conditions this new behavior as a learned response to the problem stimulus. Now, note that on this view, there's really nothing new in problem-solving behavior. The organism simply attempts at random a series of movements that, for it, have no real internal relation to the problem or the desired outcome. And once it strikes upon a good solution, the response eventually takes on the stability of an acquired behavior through repetition and reinforcement. Now, Merleau-Ponty is going to object that this behaviorist story of learning fails to account for what we actually see when we look at animals solving problems in more natural problem settings. Okay? First of all, repetition doesn't even seem to be a necessary condition for learning. Once a solution to a problem setup is discovered, it can become a regular fixture in behavior after as little as one trial. So Merleau-Ponty puts this by saying that it's not because certain behaviors are repeated that they come to be preferred. It's because they're preferred, it's because the animal sees a certain significance in this behavior that they repeat them over time. Okay? But perhaps more incisive than this kind of statistical critique, as I've put it there, is the inability of classical conditioning theory to account for a qualitative difference displayed in the creativity of problem-solving behavior. And Merleau-Ponty gives a number of different examples to try to illustrate this from animal learning studies. But in the spirit of the conference, I thought I'd look at an example that he makes much of, one that he returns to many times throughout the structure of behavior and in essays and lectures in the years following and around phenomenology of perception. And that's his discussion of Köhler's mentality of apes and the examples of animal problem solving that Köhler gives there. Okay? So in his work in comparative psychology, conducted in Tenerife during the 1910s, Köhler came to the conclusion that the classical conditioning theory, the behaviorist accounts of learning that were on offer at the time, were definitely inadequate. And he wanted to develop more natural problem-solving settings to put his subjects in. Can you guys hear me over the din out there for the moment? It's okay? Okay, sorry. Yeah. Cheers, thank you. So he wanted to set up his subjects in more natural problem-solving scenarios so he could see what kind of creativity, what kind of possibilities there were for them for problem-solving. And so these could be anything as simple as, okay, monkeys over here, bananas over there. The most obvious visual path is blocked by some obstacle, so the chimpanzee has to find an Umweg, a detour way of getting towards the goal. And other ones involved tool use. So the chimps maybe had to stack some boxes to get at a hanging banana, or they had to be able to use a stick as a tool to get at a banana through a grate or something like this. Now, rejecting the kind of classical conditioning theory, Köhler thinks that we need a different kind of learning mechanism to describe what's going on here. And you can see this, I've got this is the first quote I have on there from Köhler, discussing what goes on in this kind of learning. And he says that after many failures, Chego, one of the chimps, finally sits down quietly. But her eyes wander and soon fix on the little tree, which she had left lying a little way behind her. And all of a sudden, she seizes it quickly and surely, breaks off a branch, and immediately pulls the objective to her with it. Okay. So Köhler stresses that we must distinguish between this kind of solution and a solution through chance or trial and error, and that there's a qualitative difference here that's not captured in behaviorist accounts of learning. And now Merleau-Ponty, kind of glossing this work from Köhler, in one of his lectures from the Sorbonne, this is I think 1949 or 1950, this is the second quote there, and this is the sense of meaning making that I want to develop, pointing back to the phenomenological tradition. Merleau-Ponty says, chimpanzees are capable of conferring new meanings on objects, which are not naturally connected with them. The old and naturally established totality is destroyed in order to establish a new one. This operation merits the name of intelligence. Okay, and I'm going to try to gloss and unpack this by giving kind of a two-step account of the kind of meaning making that I take is going on here, and what warrants talking of meaning making in this case. So first of all, to speak of an organism's experience as meaningful or having a sense is to emphasize that the perceived world of the animal cannot be reduced to the objectively understood surrounding world, or to stimuli, something like that. The way the perceived world shows up depends on the animal's bodily capacities for perception and action, its experiential history, its vital interests, and its present resting state, among other things. These factors will inform the way in which the animal perceives its world. In phenomenological terminology, the animal's experiential world has an as structure, or aspectual character, and this is the sense of meaning that it has for. Now, secondly, and this gets to the making side of meaning making, for at least some kinds of perceiving organism, humans and chimps among them, the way in which the world is experienced, the aspects or the as structure, is subject to change. Such animals do not only experience as, they are also capable of experiencing otherwise. And it's this, Köhler and Merleau-Ponty believe, that examples like Chego's insight into the branch tool show us. Before appropriating it as a tool, Chego must see the branch on the bush as a potential tool in the hand. There has to be a shift in the way it's perceiving its world. And this shift in the as structure does not occur through mere chance or passive observation, but through an active, attentive modulation of the possibilities afforded by the situation, an Einsicht or insight in Köhler's terms, through which the animal comes to take up its situation in a new way. And it's this active role played by the animal in coming to experience the situation differently that warrants the talk of meaning making. Okay, so that's tentative, based off Merleau-Ponty's appropriation of Köhler in these texts, and that's what I kind of want to tentatively advance as a more phenomenologically based account of meaning making. And I'm interested to hear that critiqued, but for now. Okay, so how would REC reply to this? They've said that you only can have socially scaffolded symbol-using minds, and that's the only place that warrants talk of meaning making. And I've tried to lower that bar a little bit to allow for this kind of case of creative learning, of insight to count as a sort of meaning making. And I'm mostly going to talk about the 2013 book from Hutto and Mayen. I know that there's a new one that just came out just a little over a month ago. And I've had enough time to look at it closely enough to say that I don't think my position substantially changes, and I don't think that they've added anything that that would change what I have to say here. They add a little bit more, they say a little bit more about these topics, but I don't think enough that changes my kind of critique that I want to advance here. Okay, so first of all, we should note that Hutto and Mayen happily grant that there's an aspectual character to perception. Things are perceived in a certain way by different organisms, depending on how the organism is set up, as they put it, to receive and respond to its environment. Hutto and Mayen are simply adamant in stressing that this aspectual character does not entail that perception is representational or contentful in the sense of having truth conditions or any other kind of condition of accuracy associated with it. So thus far, there does not appear to be any substantial dispute with the view I've just articulated. If all one means by meaning is a certain aspectual character of perception, then the disagreement could just be one about terminology. Okay? But what about the claim that the aspectual character of perception is variable and in part a product of the animal's activity, the claim that meaning is made? If REC wants to do away with talk of meaning making on the level of basic minds, how does REC account for the intelligence immanent to behavior and problem solving that Merleau-Ponty and Köhler think demands a robust notion of meaning making? Now, I think this is a serious concern for REC, since developmental genetic accounts bear a heavy explanatory load in Hutto and Mayen's theory. Okay? Genetic explanations are supposed to underwrite skilled habit, which Hutto and Mayen take to be paradigm cases of the kind of contentless basic mentality that defines the REC approach. So REC, they say, gives pride of place to embodied habits and skills when it comes to explaining how sophisticated mentality emerges. And I've got the quote here for you. This is one of REC's two core theses, they tell us, and this is what they call the developmental explanatory thesis. Mentality constituting interactions are grounded in, shaped by, and explained by nothing more or other than the history of an organism's previous interactions. Sentience and sapience emerge through repeated processes of organismic engagement with environmental offerings. For organisms capable of learning, it is this and nothing else that determines which aspects of their worlds are significant to them. Nothing other than its history of active engaging structures or explains an organism's current interactive tendencies. Okay, so admittedly that is more of a promissory note than it is a detailed account of the explanatory developmental thesis. In Hutto and Mayen's Manifesto for Radical Enactivism, the 2013 book, we don't get a fuller account of how learning takes place. Hutto and Mayen discuss acquired habits and skills to illustrate the activity of basic minds, but they leave us in the dark concerning the learning and problem-solving abilities, that is, the processes of acquisition that underwrite and developmentally precede acquired habits. Okay. Now, nonetheless, based on what they do provide, the worry arises already that the account we will receive from radical enactivism will be subject to the same kind of objections that Merleau-Ponty and the Gestaltists raised against classical behaviorism. Especially suspect here is the claim, and I refer to that quote again, that sentience and sapience emerge through repeated processes of organismic engagement with environmental offerings, and that it's this and this alone that determines which aspects of the world become significant for organisms capable of learning. Because recall that Merleau-Ponty's critique of the behaviorist approach to intelligent learning is that stating things in this order puts the cart before the horse. It's not repetition that reinforces which aspects of a situation turn up as significant. Rather, it's being able to see the situation as significant in a particular way that leads the animal to repeat behavior. Or again, in the case of novel behavior, invoking again the kind of phenomenological idiom, it's not merely the accretion of habit and past behavior, but also the projection of possible future behavior that shapes the animal's conduct and experience. Okay? So I think it would be too much to conclude on the basis of what I've just said, that only a paradigm that incorporates a rich notion of meaning-making can account for such intelligent creative learning, or to assume that REC is incapable of doing so. I'll just say that in the absence of a richer account from them, I want to push the burden of proof back on their shoulders and use this kind of case of meaning-making as a challenge to pose to REC. But that said, REC's critiques of the notion of meaning-making as it's used in Enactivism are taken to heart. And I want to close here by just saying a word on that, looking at some of Evan Thompson's use of Merleau-Ponty on these notions. And I've left open for now the scope of this meaning-making phenomenon. I've extended it beyond just mere symbol manipulation, but I still leave open the scope of how far down the phylogenetic scale, if you want to put it like that, that phenomena runs in the sense that I've been discussing. So let's grant for the moment that all perceivers, whichever organisms properly merit that denomination, perceive their environment in a particular way. This is the aspectual nature of perception, something about which I believe both REC and AE are in agreement. When it comes to meaning making, however, for the sense of the term I've proposed, the examples adduced thus far only support ascribing this activity to those organisms that are capable not only of perceiving aspectually, but also of perceiving otherwise. So a chimpanzee who transcends the confusion of the problem situation and comes to see that the branch on the bush can also be the tool in the hand has achieved a creative insight, after which the structure and significance of its situation has radically changed. And to that extent, I don't think it's an extravagant claim, as Hutto and Mayan allege, to say that the animal here is playing a role in bringing forth or enacting its environment. But note that I'm staying a little bit neutral for the time being about just how far down that ability runs. And that's a very particular sense of sense-making, not the one that's broadly in use in autopoietic enactivism. And so in a 2011 paper on living ways of sense-making, Evan Thompson, clarifying the sense of sense-making, quotes one of Merleau-Ponty's late lecture courses on the concept of nature. I've got the quote for you here. I apologize, I didn't have the English available, but I've got a translation for you here. And there, Merleau-Ponty, discussing Phenomenological, writes that the reactions of the animal in the milieu, behaviors, deposit a surplus of significance on the surfaces of objects. The animal's engagement with its environment, as we've been saying, is in part responsible for bringing forth that environment, for its being disclosed under a particular aspect for the animal. Now, Thompson immediately applies Merleau-Ponty's description to microbial life, writing that the reactions of the bacteria in their milieu likewise deposit a surplus of significance on the surfaces of molecules. I have that quote for you as well, and you can find similar ones throughout his corpus. So would Merleau-Ponty endorse Thompson's extended application of the description of animal experience to microbial life? And I think if you look at the context in which Merleau-Ponty makes those comments, I think the answer is no. Indeed, he makes it clear that this description is meant to be specific not even to animal life generally, but to the life of higher animals specifically. What Merleau-Ponty has classified as reactions of the animal in the milieu do not concern just any organismic action and environment, but rather are meant to characterize quite specifically what Phenomenological calls the Werkwelt, the world of actions, which belongs only to higher animals. Alongside the Merkwelt, or the perceived world, the Werkwelt composes the Gegenwelt, which is the interiorized Umwelt of the higher animal, and which constitutes a sort of replica of the external world. Now, Merleau-Ponty, still following Phenomenological, describes the Gegenwelt as a new phenomenon in comparison to the Umwelt of lower animals. By contrast, the inferior animals exist in a sort of cohesion or closed unity, as he describes it, with their world, while the higher animals have an Umwelt that becomes a sort of opening, a world that is, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, possessed by the animal. Right. Okay, so my intent here was not to clarify those distinctions in Phenomenological, which, to be quite honest, I'm not even sure if Merleau-Ponty takes up without qualification. My point is simply that Merleau-Ponty, here in one of his latest works, as in his very first, shows careful attentiveness to both the similarities and the differences, continuities and discontinuities, not only between human and non-human modes of cognition, but between the various species of non-human organism. We risk losing sight of the continuities when, with REC, we insist on a strict dualism of basic and scaffolded minds. And we risk losing sight of the discontinuities when we overapply the idiom of meaning-making and bringing forth a milieu. In the work of Merleau-Ponty, in Enactivism's phenomenological heritage, we find an unmatched sensitivity to these issues, a sensitivity that I think is needful now as it was then, as since we can see from previous conversations, these questions remain as contentious as ever. Thank you very much.